By the end of this lesson, you will be able to create a pivot table, summarize data in a pivot table, format a pivot table, identify external data and power pivot functions, and use slicers to filter data. Let's go ahead and explore pivot tables. Pivot tables allow you to summarize or analyze large blocks of data and generate a table of results. You may be wondering why pivot tables are called pivot tables. Because they let you move data around easily by dragging and dropping fields to perform a sort of rotation on the structure of your table and at the same time change your view of the data. When you create a pivot table, you are given the option to place it on the worksheet that you currently have open or on a new one. In either case, after you create your pivot table, you can pivot, repivot, sort and summarize your data without affecting it directly. You can choose the level of detail that you want to view depending on your needs. You also have access to all of the summary functions in Excel to complete your data analysis. For example, you can have a pivot table where the SKU or stock keeping unit in the first column, quantity and value columns, have been pivoted to appear as rows. A summary of each numerical column in the pivot table is displayed by default. Before you even create a pivot table, you need to think of the questions that you are trying to answer by using it. Just like when you are working with functions or formulas, half of the work in data analysis is finding the right questions. This process is especially important for pivot tables because how you construct them depends on the question that you are asking. Once you know the question that you would like the pivot table to answer, you can start constructing the pivot table. While there are no hard and fast rules to constructing a pivot table, there are some ways to make it easier. Here are a few tips to keep in mind when you're constructing your pivot table. First, it is usually best to create rows and columns using fields that have a relatively low set number of entries. Using entries that span a huge swathe of data, such as 5 years of transaction numbers, to create rows and columns can only cause confusion rather than answer any specific questions. To create a row out of a field that you need an answer from, and then create a column out of that criterion to narrow down the answer. For example, you can have a range that contains 34 rows of data about product SKUs or stock keeping units, their warehouse location, their quantities and their value. If you create a pivot table from this data set, it answers the question, what is the total value of the products stored in each warehouse? When you want to answer a question, you can change the function that is used by the pivot table. For example, suppose you want to see how many different products each warehouse has, not a total count. You could do this by adding the SKU field as a column and applying the count function. Let's now look at the Create Pivot Table dialog box. The first step to creating a pivot table is to open the Create Pivot Table dialog box by clicking Insert, then Pivot Table. You can use the controls in the Create Pivot Table dialog box to choose the data set or data source for the new pivot table that you are creating and where you want it to be placed. By default, new pivot tables are placed on new worksheets, but you do have the option of adding them to your existing worksheets in your workbook. After you select your options, click OK to create the pivot table. You'll notice that in the worksheet area, your cursor is now sitting in a placeholder. This is the area where the pivot table will appear, and it will flex to hold any number of rows or columns of results. Now that you've created your pivot table, let's look at the Pivot Table Field task pane. The Pivot Table Field task pane is the primary tool that you will use to configure pivot tables. Note that it is hidden when the pivot table is not selected. First, the top portion of this pane lists all of the fields from the dataset that you can add to the pivot table. To add or remove a field from the pivot table, toggle the corresponding checkbox. Or to give you more control over field placement on the pivot table, you can click and drag these fields to the pivot table itself. Note that field names are derived from the column header in the dataset. Next, the bottom half of this pane has 4 areas: filters, columns, rows and values. If you drag fields between these areas, you can change the structure of the pivot table and choose the values that will be used to make calculations. Let's take a closer look at these 4 areas. Adding fields to the filters area will include those field values as filter criteria. The columns area will create columns out of unique field entries. Similarly, the rows area will create rows out of unique field entries. Finally, fields that are dragged to the values area will have calculations performed on them or their values summarized. Note that any fields that appear in these 4 areas will include a pull-down arrow that gives you access to a number of different settings, and the Field Settings dialog box, which you can use to further customize your pivot table. Look at how you can summarize data in a pivot table. When you combine options from the Summarize Values By and the Show Values As tabs on the Value Field Settings dialog box, it provides further insight into your data. For example, suppose that you want to calculate the total unit price of all the products that each warehouse is storing. You can do this by dragging the unit price field to the Values area of the pivot table field task pane. Notice that it has already calculated an overall total, and this is now visible in the pivot table in the worksheet. But how is this result being calculated? If you click the drop-down arrow for this field and click the Field Settings option to open the Value Field Settings dialog box, you can see that sum is the default function. You can change how Excel is analysing the data by selecting a different function such as average. Now, whatever heading is added to the rows box, the overall total will be broken down into a series of subtotals by that heading. Drag the warehouse heading into the rows box and the pivot table then displays the sum of the unit prices found in each warehouse. You can retrieve results from pivot tables in other parts of your workbook using the Get Pivot Data function. The syntax is Get Pivot Data open parentheses, then the data field, the pivot table, and finally the fields and items. This syntax may seem complicated, but Excel simplifies the process of building the function by automatically inserting it. For example, if you select cell D2, typing equals, then clicking on cell B9, which contains the sum of the value of the SKU 1567, it will create the Get Pivot Data function automatically. The value of this function is that it will return the correct value as long as it remains visible in the pivot table. Now that we have seen how to use the Summarize Values By tab or the Value Field Settings dialog box, let's use the same example and suppose that you want to see the percentage of the total inventory value that each warehouse holds. You could do this calculation manually, but it would be easier to change how the values are shown. Within the Show Values As tab of the Value Field Settings dialog box, you would click the Percentage of Grand Total option from the Show Values As drop-down menu. You will now see what percentage of the grand total each warehouse holds. In this case, you can see that warehouse A contains products with a larger value, while warehouse C has the lowest value. When you are working with pivot tables, you will see two contextual tabs. Let's focus on the Design tab. In the Design tab, you can add layout elements to your pivot table, customize style options, and apply a style in the same way that you would with a regular table. You can modify these options at any time. But what if your data is outside of Excel? For example, an Excel spreadsheet can only hold 1.5 million rows of data. What if you're working with population data and you have millions of rows of data? If the data that you would like to analyze exists outside of Excel, such as in a Microsoft Access database, you can still use pivot tables to summarize it. To do this, use an already established connection to that data by opening the Create Pivot Table dialog box and then clicking the Use an External Data Source radio button. Next, click the Choose Connection button. In the Existing Connections dialog box, you can choose from existing connections that exist and browse for more connections. To give you more control over filtering capabilities, Excel provides slicers. Slicers are easy-to-use filters that can be applied multiple times without negative effects on the data's readability. The purpose of pivot tables is to help you analyze information and find patterns or trends that might be difficult to spot in a large volume of raw data. The slicer tool takes this idea to the next level. You can create slicers out of any field that exists within the dataset for the pivot table. You can then use these slicers to filter each field by its unique entries. For example, if you wanted to filter out data from one of the 3 warehouses in a worksheet that tracks inventory, a slicer would be able to do that for you easily. Slicers can also be linked to more than one pivot table. Situations like this usually occur when you are using raw transactional data as a dataset and when you have multiple pivot tables for that data. You can toggle between filtering and not filtering unique values from the field by simply clicking these buttons. Filters in a slicer that are not applied appear blue, while those that are white are active. If a filter button is grayed out, this indicates that an already active filter has removed the values represented by this filter from view. You can apply multiple filters that exist in the same slicer at once by holding down the Control key and clicking on each filter that you would like to apply. Now let's explore how you can insert slicers. Slicers are graphics that can be moved, resized like charts. They also have their own format ribbon, so can be customized to different colors. To create a slicer, first click anywhere in the pivot table to display the Pivot Table Tools tabs. Next, click Insert, then Slicer. You can also click Table Design, then Insert Slicer to insert a slicer when working with tables. This action displays the Insert Slicers dialog box. This dialog box lists each field in the pivot table with a checkbox. You can create a slicer from a field by checking its associated checkbox. After you've finished choosing the fields that you would like to appear as filters, click OK to apply your settings. When you return to the worksheet, you will now see the slicers placed there.